The desert wind howls, the blistering heat radiating off the sand in shimmering waves. It's a world where time seems to stand still, where the earth itself seems to swallow every trace of life, leaving only the tracks of soldiers and machines etched into the landscape. Through the haze, a convoy of German tanks crawls across the barren stretch, the hum of engines barely audible over the distant roar of artillery. General Erwin Rommel, known as the Desert Fox, scans the horizon, his eyes narrow, sweat trickling down his face. The sand feels like fire against his skin, but his mind is sharp, always calculating, always anticipating the enemy's next move. He's been here before, orchestrating rapid strikes and outflanking enemy positions with a brilliance that has earned him the admiration of his men and the fear of his foes. Yet, something doesn't feel right today. A message arrives, hurriedly delivered by one of his officers, and Rommel's eyes flicker over the words. The British are closer than expected. The movement of his forces has been detected. The trap he set might not be enough to stop them. Rommel takes a deep breath, looking back at the approaching dust storm. His mind races. Is this just a momentary setback, or has the Desert Fox underestimated his enemies? Is victory still within his grasp, or has he already been outflanked? A binary question. Was this a moment of miscalculation or an inevitable turn of fate? The stakes are higher than ever. Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, was a figure who embodied the ideal of a military genius, cunning, decisive, and relentless in pursuit of victory. His reputation as one of the most skilled commanders in World War II was cemented early in the North African campaign, where he led the German Afrika Korps with unmatched speed and precision. Known for his unconventional tactics, Rommel was a master of maneuver warfare, particularly in the deserts of North Africa, where the harsh environment itself could be as much of an enemy as the opposing forces. Born in 1891, Rommel's early career was marked by steady but unspectacular service in the German military during World War I. He gained recognition during the war for his daring and resourceful tactics in the trenches, where he demonstrated a keen understanding of small unit tactics and an ability to motivate his men in even the most challenging circumstances. After the war, Rommel continued his military education, eventually gaining a reputation as a proficient officer within the interwar years. His rise to prominence came when the German army found itself embroiled in the chaos of World War II. Rommel's rapid ascent was largely due to his success in France during the Blitzkrieg campaign, where his leadership in the invasion of France earned him Hitler's favor. His ability to adapt to the rapidly changing nature of warfare and his unwavering commitment to seizing the initiative made him the perfect candidate for leadership in the North African theater. In 1941, Rommel took command of the Afrika Korps, tasked with supporting the Italian forces who were faltering against the British Eighth Army in North Africa. The situation was dire for the Axis powers, as British forces under General Wavell had already pushed the Italians to the brink of collapse. But Rommel's genius soon came to the forefront. His early campaigns in North Africa were marked by bold, aggressive tactics, which focused on using the terrain and speed to outflank and surprise the British. His ability to quickly maneuver his forces through the vast desert and strike unexpectedly became his trademark. Rommel's tactics were built on the core principle of mobility. He utilized tanks and motorized infantry in coordinated rapid assaults to strike behind enemy lines before they had a chance to regroup. This ability to exploit weaknesses in the enemy's defenses made Rommel a nightmare for the British. At the Battle of Agadabia in 1941, he demonstrated his skill at maneuver warfare, outflanking the British Eighth Army and forcing them to retreat. This victory secured Rommel's reputation as a tactician who could outthink and outmaneuver his opponents with stunning efficiency. However, Rommel's brilliance was not just in his tactics, it was also in his leadership. He inspired loyalty in his men through a combination of respect and charisma. Unlike many other high-ranking officers, Rommel was not content to remain behind the front lines. He often led from the front, sharing the hardships of the soldiers and making decisions based on first-hand knowledge of the battlefield. This approach not only earned him the admiration of his men, but also gave him a unique understanding of the challenges they faced. Rommel's tactics and leadership in North Africa made him an iconic figure, but they also created expectations that would weigh heavily on him as the war dragged on. By 1942, the tides of war were changing, and Rommel's forces would soon find themselves facing challenges they could not overcome. The question now was whether his talents could continue to turn the tide in the desert, or if the forces arrayed against him had finally outgrown his ability to keep up. The Second Battle of El Alamein, fought between October 23 and November 11, 1942, would become a defining moment not only for Erwin Rommel, but for the entire North African campaign. It marked the turning point of the war in North Africa, signaling the end of Axis expansion and the beginning of their retreat. The battle itself was not just about tanks and artillery. It was a clash of wills, a test of endurance, strategy, and the ability to adapt under the most extreme pressure. El Alamein was strategically vital. Positioned in Egypt, it was the gateway to the Suez Canal, the lifeline to British colonial holdings in the Middle East, India, and the oil fields of the Persian Gulf. Whoever controlled El Alamein controlled access to these resources, and by extension, held the power to shape the direction of the entire war in the Mediterranean. For the Axis powers, especially Rommel's Africa Corps, losing control of this position would mean the collapse of their North African ambitions. For the Allies, it represented a crucial opportunity to halt the Axis advance and start pushing them out of Africa altogether. Rommel, having enjoyed a string of successes in the desert, was now facing a battle of a different magnitude. His forces, although formidable, had been stretched thin, worn down by continuous fighting and logistical difficulties. He had faced supply shortages, inadequate reinforcement, and the ever-present pressure of fighting on multiple fronts. In contrast, the British Eighth Army, commanded by General Bernard Montgomery, had been reinforced and was now better equipped than ever before. Montgomery, who took command in August 1942, was determined to end the Axis presence in North Africa once and for all. Montgomery's preparation for the battle was meticulous. His forces outnumbered Rommel's, with approximately 200,000 British, Commonwealth, and colonial troops facing around 100,000 German and Italian soldiers. The Allies also had the advantage of superior logistical support, air superiority, and more advanced weaponry, all of which would play a critical role in the coming battle. Montgomery understood that this battle would be won not just through tactical brilliance, but through the careful management of his resources, and he made sure that every detail was covered: supply lines, troop morale, and the timing of the assault. Rommel, however, was no stranger to adversity. His first reaction to the British buildup was one of defiance and readiness. He knew that the British would soon launch their attack, and he anticipated the likely direction of their strike. His plan was to defend key positions while looking for an opportunity to strike back at any weaknesses in the British lines. Rommel's strategy was to hold his ground and wait for the right moment to exploit British mistakes. The challenge, though, was that Montgomery had anticipated Rommel's tactics. Rommel's forces, spread thin across a long line of defense, were vulnerable to the kind of concentrated, overwhelming assault that the British were preparing. The British had spent months preparing their offensive, building up supplies, and laying the groundwork for a massive assault. They also used deception and misdirection to confuse the Axis forces, making it difficult for Rommel to gauge where the main thrust would come from. The battle began on October 23rd, with the British launching a heavy artillery barrage, followed by an infantry assault. Rommel, caught off guard by the scale of the offensive, initially underestimated the intensity of the attack, but he quickly realized the true extent of the threat. His forces were already being stretched to their limits, and as the battle raged on, it became clear that the situation was growing more desperate by the hour. Rommel's position, which had once seemed unassailable, was now in jeopardy. The British had cracked the Axis defenses, forcing Rommel to rethink his plans on the fly. As the battle unfolded over the following days, Rommel was forced into a defensive position, unable to launch the counterattacks that had previously served him so well. This was not just a test of his tactical genius. It was a trial of endurance. Rommel, for the first time in the North African campaign, found himself fighting against an enemy that was not only better equipped but also better prepared and more coordinated. With the British offensive picking up speed, the Axis forces began to feel the weight of their disadvantage. Rommel's troops, already fatigued from the prolonged fighting and logistical difficulties, struggled to hold their ground. It was clear that the battle would not be won by the swift, outflanking maneuvers that had characterized Rommel's earlier successes. Instead, it would be won through sheer force of numbers and strategic execution. This was a battle Rommel could not win alone, and he knew it. By the time the first few days of fighting had passed, it was apparent that Rommel's forces were being outflanked, overwhelmed, and gradually pushed back. Rommel, a commander known for his decisiveness and swift action, now faced a strategic dilemma. Should he retreat or continue to fight in a battle that was quickly slipping away from him? The British Eighth Army, under the command of General Bernard Montgomery, had spent months preparing for the offensive that would ultimately turn the tide of the North African campaign. Montgomery, who had taken command just months before the battle, was determined to break the Axis stranglehold on North Africa and deliver a decisive blow to the Desert Fox. Unlike Rommel, who was often forced to make do with limited resources, Montgomery enjoyed the advantage of well-stocked supply lines, a massive logistical effort, and superior manpower. The British had learned from past mistakes and were prepared for a battle that would stretch their forces to the limit, but they knew that the success of the campaign would hinge on precision and discipline. The scale of the British preparation was enormous. Montgomery's forces consisted of around 200,000 soldiers from the British Army, the Commonwealth nations, and various colonial forces. This included soldiers from Australia, New Zealand, India, South Africa, and other territories of the British Empire. Alongside these infantry units, the British had over 1,000 tanks, which would be crucial for the breakthrough. In addition, Montgomery had gathered vast quantities of artillery, aircraft, and support units, all of which would ensure the offensive's success. This overwhelming force stood in stark contrast to Rommel's stretched and undermanned Africa Corps, which was significantly outnumbered. Perhaps one of the most critical factors in the British preparation was the comprehensive intelligence network they had built. British codebreakers had managed to crack the Axis communication codes, allowing Montgomery and his staff to anticipate Rommel's movements and prepare their own plans accordingly. This intelligence was used to identify weaknesses in the Axis defenses and to plan the assault with incredible precision. The British were also aided by newly developed tactics, including the ability to clear minefields and create new paths for their tanks and infantry to move through areas previously considered impassable. Montgomery was also keenly aware of the psychological aspects of warfare. He understood the importance of morale, not just for his own forces, but for the Axis troops as well. Rommel's forces, though battle-hardened, were demoralized after months of continuous fighting, and the harsh desert environment had taken its toll on them. Montgomery used this to his advantage, ensuring that his troops were well-rested, well-supplied, and ready for the coming battle. He also understood that a prolonged siege on Rommel's forces could lead to disarray within the Axis command. To prevent any surprise, Montgomery kept his troops' movements secret, employing deceptive tactics and false signals to keep Rommel guessing. One of the most notable aspects of Montgomery's strategy was his use of deception and misdirection. As the British built up their forces near El Alamein, they launched a series of diversionary tactics to make Rommel believe that their main offensive would occur in a different area. This caused confusion within Rommel's camp and delayed his ability to properly defend the actual attack point. The British also utilized camouflage and feigned movements, creating the illusion of a much larger force than they actually had. The goal was to overwhelm Rommel's defenses with a combination of surprise, deception, and sheer firepower. Additionally, Montgomery's forces were aided by the support of the Royal Air Force, RAF, which played a vital role in the campaign. British aircraft provided air superiority, bombing Axis positions and disrupting supply lines, while also providing close air support for the ground troops. The RAF's ability to control the skies above the battlefield meant that Rommel's tanks and infantry were vulnerable to airstrikes, further limiting his ability to maneuver effectively. Montgomery's final element of preparation was the timing of the attack. He chose to launch the offensive during the full moon, when visibility would be optimal for the British forces, and under the cover of darkness. The British could maneuver more freely while Rommel's forces struggled to keep up with the rapid changes in the battlefield. This timing was crucial, as it allowed the British to establish superiority before Rommel could fully react. The stage was set for a confrontation that would shape the outcome of the war in North Africa. The British had spent months meticulously preparing every aspect of the battle, ensuring that they had the necessary resources, intelligence, and timing to deliver a devastating blow to Rommel's forces. With such overwhelming preparation, it seemed only a matter of time before the British forces would break through Rommel's defenses and force him to retreat. For Rommel, the writing was on the wall. The battle would be unlike anything he had faced before. His forces, although skilled and experienced, were no match for the scale of the British assault. As the first shells of the battle began to fall, Rommel would realize that his position, long considered unassailable, was now vulnerable. As the Second Battle of El Alamein raged on, the Axis forces under Rommel found themselves struggling on multiple fronts. The circumstances that had once favored them, the mobility of their forces, the surprise tactics they used, and Rommel's personal leadership were now becoming liabilities. The battle had escalated into a war of attrition, and the resources available to the Axis were insufficient to withstand the massive Allied offensive. One of the most significant challenges that Rommel's forces faced was the issue of supply lines. Unlike the British, who had the advantage of relatively secure lines of communication through the Mediterranean, Rommel's forces were stretched thin, dependent on long and perilous supply routes that snaked through the vast desert. These supply lines were constantly under attack by British forces, making it difficult for Rommel's troops to maintain their strength and sustain their operations. The Axis forces had already been suffering from a shortage of fuel, ammunition, and food, and the prolonged fighting at El Alamein only exacerbated these shortages. In addition to supply problems, Rommel's forces were increasingly demoralized. The soldiers of the Afrika Korps, many of whom had been fighting in the desert for months, were physically and mentally exhausted. They had endured the harsh conditions of the North African desert, blistering heat by day, freezing temperatures by night, and a constant battle against dehydration and fatigue. Even Rommel's best units were beginning to falter under the strain. The long-standing supply issues had meant that soldiers were often unable to get the rest or nourishment they needed, and the morale of the troops began to plummet as the British offensive ramped up. Rommel's reliance on Italian forces also proved to be a serious handicap. While his German troops were well-trained and battle-hardened, the Italian soldiers were often under-equipped, poorly supplied, and lacked the experience necessary to face the British assault. The Italian forces, which were tasked with holding key positions alongside Rommel's Afrika Korps, frequently faltered under the pressure of the battle. At critical moments during the battle, Rommel's plans were thrown into disarray due to the lack of coordination between the German and Italian units, a problem that had plagued his campaign throughout the war. The communication breakdowns between the German and Italian commands only added to the confusion. Rommel, who had grown accustomed to making rapid decisions and coordinating his forces with exceptional speed, found himself hampered by the slower and less effective Italian response. As a result, crucial reinforcements and supplies were delayed or misdirected, and opportunities for counterattacks were missed. Rommel had always been able to rely on the speed and agility of his forces, but with his allies' forces faltering, his own ability to execute his signature flanking maneuvers was severely limited. While Rommel had earned a reputation for anticipating his enemy's moves and adapting his tactics on the fly, this time, the British forces were too well prepared. Their superior numbers, better logistics, and overwhelming firepower forced Rommel to adopt a purely defensive posture. His forces, stretched across a wide front, struggled to repel the British assault. Tanks, which had once been a decisive advantage for the Afrika Korps, were now facing increasingly effective anti-tank weapons and coordinated airstrikes. The desert, once a place where Rommel had thrived, was now a trap with no room to maneuver or surprise the enemy. By the third day of fighting, Rommel realized that the situation was growing untenable. His defensive positions were being gradually overrun, and the Axis forces were no longer able to respond with the same speed and precision that had once defined them. The British, having gained the initiative, continued to press their attack, exploiting gaps in the Axis lines and outflanking positions that Rommel had thought impregnable. Rommel, known for his ability to read the battlefield and make rapid decisions, now found himself in a position where every move he made seemed to play into the hands of the British. Rommel's usual confidence began to waver. He had always been able to adapt to changing situations, but this battle was different. The overwhelming British forces, coupled with the deteriorating conditions of his own army, left him with few options. In moments of desperation, Rommel attempted to shift his forces and plug the holes in his defenses. However, the logistical and communication breakdowns, combined with the weakness of his Italian allies, meant that his efforts were in vain. By the end of the fourth day of the battle, it was clear that the Axis forces could no longer hold their ground. Rommel's forces were being pushed back, and the prospect of victory was slipping further out of reach. The battle had become a brutal slog, with Rommel's troops fighting not just against the British, but against the overwhelming tide of attrition, exhaustion, and miscommunication that had slowly but surely eroded their ability to fight back. The Desert Fox, once the master of quick, decisive moves, was now being forced into a defensive retreat, struggling to maintain any semblance of order as the British continued their relentless advance. As the British forces gained momentum and pushed deeper into the Axis lines, Rommel, ever the tactician, realized that he could not afford to let them continue their assault unhindered. His instinct, honed over years of desert warfare, was to fight back with speed, striking when the enemy least expected it. Rommel's reputation as the Desert Fox was built on his ability to execute lightning-fast counterattacks, often outflanking and enveloping the enemy before they could react. This was the strategy that had brought him success in the past, and he knew it was his only hope for turning the tide at El Alamein. However, this time, the circumstances were far more complicated. Rommel's forces were spread thin across a wide front, and his resources were severely depleted. The logistical and supply issues that had been haunting his campaign for months had left him with fewer tanks, less ammunition, and a weakened fighting force. Despite this, Rommel was determined to act quickly. He ordered a series of counterattacks designed to disrupt the British advance and create openings for a strategic retreat. His plan was to create confusion, to force Montgomery to divert forces away from the main offensive, and to buy time for a more coordinated withdrawal. Rommel's plan was to use his remaining armor and infantry to attack the British flanks during the cover of darkness. He hoped that the British would be caught off guard, and that his forces, though outnumbered, could punch through weak points in the British lines. It was a bold move, one that required precision, speed, and a high level of coordination between his units. Rommel knew that the success of this counterattack would depend on the element of surprise, a concept that he had used to his advantage many times in the past. The first phase of the counterattack began at nightfall on October 25th, with Rommel's forces launching a series of rapid assaults on the British flanks. The plan was to strike quickly and retreat just as fast, exploiting gaps in the British defenses before they could organize a counterattack. Rommel's tanks and motorized infantry moved swiftly through the desert, hoping to catch the British off guard and inflict significant damage to their supply lines and artillery positions. However, the realities of war quickly became apparent. Rommel's forces were exhausted, and many of his units were unable to keep up with the pace of the attack. The British had anticipated the possibility of a counterattack, and their positions were more fortified than Rommel had expected. Despite his efforts, the counterattack failed to achieve the level of success he had hoped for. The British lines held, and the Axis forces found themselves bogged down in fierce fighting, unable to capitalize on any potential breakthroughs. To make matters worse, Rommel's Italian allies, who had been stationed at key defensive points, were unable to execute their part of the plan. Communication between the German and Italian forces had been problematic throughout the campaign, and in this critical moment, the lack of coordination was glaring. The Italian forces failed to keep up with Rommel's rapidly changing orders, and their defensive positions were easily overrun by the British. Rommel had been relying on the Italian units to secure his flanks, but their inability to respond effectively left his forces exposed. Rommel's frustration mounted as he watched his plans unravel. He had always prided himself on his ability to think on his feet and adapt to the battlefield, but this time, the combination of logistical failure, insufficient reinforcements, and his Italian allies' shortcomings made it impossible to turn the tide. The counterattack, instead of achieving the desired surprise, had only hastened the Axis forces' collapse. As the hours wore on, Rommel attempted to reorganize his forces, shifting them into a new position under the cover of darkness. He ordered his remaining tanks and infantry to pull back and regroup, hoping to find an opening in the British defenses. But the British were relentless, and their overwhelming numbers combined with their superior logistical support made it increasingly difficult for Rommel to maintain any semblance of control over the battlefield. By the morning of October 26, it was clear that Rommel's counterattack had failed. His forces were scattered, disorganized, and unable to maintain the rapid pace of movement that had once been their hallmark. The British, meanwhile, had begun to consolidate their positions and prepare for the next phase of their offensive. Rommel was now left with little choice but to reconsider his options. Despite the failure of the counterattack, Rommel refused to give up. He knew that retreating without a fight was not an option, but the growing realization that he was facing a much stronger force than anticipated began to settle in. For the first time in the campaign, Rommel was forced to acknowledge the possibility that victory might be out of reach, at least in the short term. The Desert Fox had been outflanked, not in the sudden tactical strike he was so accustomed to, but by the slow, grinding pressure of an enemy that was better prepared, better supplied, and more determined than he had anticipated. As the battle continued, Rommel found himself in the impossible position of trying to hold a position that was slipping from his grasp. He had acted decisively, as always, but this time, his usual brilliance had been outmatched by the scale and coordination of the British assault. The counterattack had failed, and now, Rommel was forced to consider his next move, a retreat or an attempt to salvage something from the crumbling front. By the fifth day of the battle, it was apparent that Rommel's forces were no longer capable of halting the British offensive. The battle for El Alamein had escalated from a tense standoff to a full-scale breakthrough, and the desert battlefield was now a chaotic, bloody expanse. Rommel, known for his quick decision-making and ability to adapt to any situation, found himself increasingly cornered. The British, having successfully breached his defensive lines, were now in control of the momentum, and the once-feared Africa Corps was being pushed into retreat. The British breakthrough came on October 26 after days of intense fighting. Montgomery's forces, having gained ground through their relentless artillery bombardments and coordinated infantry assaults, found the cracks in the Axis defenses and exploited them with brutal efficiency. The British Eighth Army had achieved air superiority, and their tanks, infantry, and artillery struck with overwhelming force. Rommel, unable to reposition his troops effectively or bring reinforcements to the front, was forced to witness the collapse of his carefully constructed defense. The breakthrough itself was a result of meticulous British planning and sheer force of numbers. Montgomery had methodically built up his forces over months, and when the attack came, it was unrelenting. The first breach occurred along a critical stretch of Rommel's defensive line, where British forces, using newly devised mine-clearing technology, tore through the Axis defenses. Rommel had anticipated a British offensive, but the scale and intensity of the assault took him by surprise. His forces, already stretched thin and facing constant logistical problems, could not match the precision of the British advance. As the British forces advanced, they exploited Rommel's weakness, his reliance on long, vulnerable supply lines. The Axis forces were cut off from reinforcements, and Rommel's remaining reserves were insufficient to plug the widening gaps in his defenses. The Eighth Army's tanks, led by General Sir Bernard Montgomery's well-coordinated thrust, quickly moved to encircle Axis positions, forcing Rommel into a desperate defensive posture. The once imposing Axis defensive positions, built over months of preparation, were crumbling under the weight of the British attack. Rommel, ever the strategist, knew the situation was dire. In previous battles, he had used his ability to move swiftly across the desert to create surprise and outflank his opponents. But here, his forces were bogged down, unable to maneuver as freely as they had in the past. The British had anticipated his movements and were now leveraging their overwhelming firepower to dismantle his positions one by one. The speed of the British breakthrough caught Rommel off guard. Within a matter of hours, entire sections of his defensive line were breached. The tanks, artillery, and infantry continued their relentless assault, with the Axis forces struggling to hold their ground. Rommel, with his strategic brilliance, attempted to regroup and counterattack, but the situation had already reached the tipping point. His forces were no longer in a position to strike back. They were now fighting a desperate rearguard action to preserve whatever ground they could. The psychological toll on Rommel's command was immense. He had built his reputation on his ability to adapt to any situation, to turn the tide in battles where others saw only defeat. But now, he found himself in a battle that he could not win. The desert, once a place where he thrived, had become a trap. The scale of the British offensive and the rapid collapse of his defenses left him with little room to maneuver. The breakthrough was not a single moment of failure. It was the result of days of mounting pressure, logistics failures, and relentless British precision. In the midst of the breakthrough, Rommel made a critical decision: to withdraw his remaining forces. By October 27th, he began ordering his troops to fall back in an attempt to salvage whatever they could from the collapse. Rommel's brilliance in maneuver warfare was not enough to overcome the overwhelming force of the British Eighth Army. His once proud Africa Corps, stretched thin and undermanned, was now in full retreat, and the British, having broken through the Axis defenses, were poised to drive Rommel out of North Africa. As Rommel's forces began their retreat toward Tunisia, it became clear that the Axis had lost control of North Africa. The Battle of El Alamein, while not the end of Rommel's military career, marked the beginning of the end for the Axis presence in the region. Rommel, known for his resilience and tactical ingenuity, was now faced with the reality of his defeat. The British, having pushed the Axis forces back, were on the cusp of securing a decisive victory in the desert. Rommel's decision to withdraw was not made lightly. He had always been a fighter, willing to stand his ground against overwhelming odds. But in the face of the British breakthrough, he realized that continuing the fight would only lead to further losses. The battle was over, and with it, the dream of Axis victory in North Africa. As the British pressed forward, Rommel's retreat marked the beginning of a long and difficult struggle for survival, as the tide of the war in Africa shifted irreversibly in favor of the Allies. The role of Italy in the North African campaign is often a point of contention when discussing the Axis power struggle in the desert. For much of the campaign, Italy was a key ally of Nazi Germany, yet their forces were, at best, a mixed blessing for Rommel's operations. The Axis strategy in North Africa was a partnership between the Germans and Italians, but this alliance was fraught with difficulties. While Rommel's Africa Corps was one of the most effective and well-coordinated forces in the desert, the Italian military, though sizable, was plagued by logistical issues, lack of morale, and a significant difference in quality compared to their German counterparts. Rommel's relationship with the Italian forces was complicated. Despite his respect for the Italian soldiers' determination, Rommel was often frustrated by their lack of readiness and cohesion. Italy's military was significantly underfunded and ill-prepared for the challenges of modern warfare. When Rommel took command of the Africa Corps in 1941, he found himself having to shoulder the burden of coordinating with Italian units that were frequently undermanned, poorly equipped, and lacking the tactical expertise that Rommel's German forces had. The Italian forces were tasked with holding large swaths of territory and critical positions in the front lines, but they often lacked the ability to defend these areas effectively. This became particularly problematic in the face of the British onslaught during the Second Battle of El Alamein. Rommel, known for his independent decision-making and tactical brilliance, found himself frequently in the position of compensating for the Italian weaknesses. The Axis strategy in North Africa relied on German mobility, armored units, and swift tactical strikes, qualities that Rommel excelled in. But the Italians were expected to support this strategy with their own forces, and too often, their performance was insufficient. During critical moments of the battle, such as the British breakthrough, the Italian units struggled to hold key defensive positions, leaving the Germans to fill the gaps. This lack of coordination proved disastrous for Rommel, who had to rely on his Italian allies to defend critical points but found them unable to mount an effective resistance. As the battle unfolded, the Italian forces became more of a hindrance than a help. Rommel's initial plans had called for coordinated efforts between the German and Italian troops, but poor communication and logistical challenges made this impossible. When Rommel attempted his counterattacks during the early stages of the British offensive, Italian units were unable to move quickly enough or execute the planned operations. Their inability to keep up with Rommel's fast-moving maneuvers became one of the key reasons for the failure of his counterattacks. In some cases, the Italian forces were overrun by the British advance, leaving German forces to fend for themselves or risk being surrounded. One of the most critical failures involving the Italian forces occurred when they inadvertently exposed Rommel's movements. Rommel had attempted to shift his forces under cover of darkness, hoping to reposition them to more defensible locations. However, Italian units, either due to their lack of coordination or poor execution of orders, inadvertently revealed the German positions to the British. This miscommunication between German and Italian forces proved to be a costly mistake, as it compromised Rommel's efforts to reorganize and defend his troops. The British, using their superior intelligence, quickly adapted and capitalized on this mistake, further damaging the Axis defensive line. In addition to the tactical and logistical shortcomings, the Italian forces' inability to defend their positions created gaps in the Axis lines that the British eagerly exploited. While Rommel was able to counter some of these breaches, the sheer number of them, combined with the breakdown in communication between the Axis forces, left Rommel with little room to maneuver. As the British broke through the Axis defenses, they quickly overwhelmed the Italian units, and Rommel's retreat became inevitable. Despite these shortcomings, the Italian forces remained a significant part of the Axis presence in North Africa until the final stages of the campaign. Rommel, who had relied on Italian troops throughout much of the campaign, could not simply abandon them. However, by the time of the Second Battle of El Alamein, Rommel was forced to reckon with the reality that the Italian contribution to the battle had become more of a liability than an asset. The disparity in the quality of the forces and the lack of effective coordination made it increasingly difficult for Rommel to fight the British on equal terms. In the aftermath of El Alamein, as the Axis forces were pushed back into Tunisia, the issue of Italy's role in the North African campaign became even more pronounced. While the German forces, under Rommel's leadership, had fought bravely and with skill, the Italian forces had proven unable to maintain the pressure required to stop the British offensive. The collaboration between the two powers had been vital to the Axis campaign, but the shortcomings of Italy's military were now impossible to ignore. Rommel, ever pragmatic, was forced to adapt once more, and as the retreat from El Alamein began, it was clear that Italy's inability to hold the line had contributed heavily to the Axis defeat. Rommel's final decision to withdraw was influenced not only by the overwhelming British forces, but also by the failures of his Italian allies. For Rommel, the battle had highlighted the limitations of relying on Italy's military forces, and it marked the beginning of the end of the Axis partnership in North Africa. While the Italian soldiers fought bravely, their inadequacies ultimately contributed to the loss of the Desert War, leaving Rommel to make the painful decision to retreat and regroup. One final concession to the overwhelming might of the British Eighth Army. By the end of October 1942, the tide of the Battle of El Alamein had decisively turned in favor of the British. Rommel, once a commander known for his swift, decisive strikes and brilliant tactical maneuvers, now found himself in a desperate struggle to maintain his position in the face of a superior Allied force. His defensive lines, which had once seemed impenetrable, were now crumbling under the pressure of Montgomery's relentless assault. The British, having broken through the Axis defenses, were not only pushing the Axis forces back, but also threatening to envelop them entirely. The final stages of the battle were marked by a sense of inevitability. Rommel, who had often relied on the element of surprise and rapid maneuvering to win his battles, now found himself in a situation where his trademark tactics were no longer viable. His forces were exhausted, their morale shattered by the prolonged fighting and the harsh conditions of the desert. The British, with their overwhelming numbers and superior logistical support, had gained the upper hand, and Rommel's options were rapidly diminishing. As the British continued to press forward, Rommel realized that his position was becoming untenable. The breakthrough at the southern end of the Axis line, combined with the steady collapse of his defenses, left him with no choice but to consider retreat. But even that option was fraught with difficulties. The desert, which had once been Rommel's greatest asset, had become a vast, unforgiving landscape that provided little cover for a retreat. The British, having already gained air superiority, were now able to disrupt any attempts at withdrawal, attacking Rommel's supply lines and communication routes. Rommel, who had spent his career outflanking his enemies, now found himself outflanked in a way he could not counter. His troops, weary from months of continuous fighting, were no longer capable of holding the line. The British offensive, which had been carefully planned and executed with precision, had left the Axis forces with few viable options. Rommel's attempts to reorganize and regroup were hampered by a lack of coordination between his forces, compounded by the ongoing failure of the Italian units to hold their ground. The psychological toll on Rommel was evident. As a commander, he had always been able to inspire his men, leading from the front and sharing in their hardships. But now, faced with the reality of impending defeat, Rommel's usual calm and confidence began to crack. He knew that his situation was no longer one of tactical flexibility, but of survival. The British forces, having gained the initiative, were now exploiting every weakness in the Axis position, leaving Rommel with little room to maneuver. As the days wore on, Rommel's defensive lines began to disintegrate further. The British, through a combination of artillery bombardments, airstrikes, and coordinated infantry and tank assaults, pushed deeper into the Axis positions. Rommel, knowing that his forces were now stretched beyond their capacity, ordered a full retreat to the coastal town of Tunis. The retreat was a difficult and painful decision for a commander who had always prided himself on his ability to win against the odds. But as the British advanced, it became clear that holding El Alamein was no longer a viable option. Rommel's retreat was not without further complications. As the Axis forces withdrew, they encountered a series of logistical obstacles that made the situation even more dire. The retreat itself became a chaotic and disorganized affair, with units breaking contact with one another and struggling to maintain cohesion. The British, sensing victory within their grasp, relentlessly pursued Rommel's forces, attacking supply convoys and preventing any attempts at an orderly withdrawal. The desert, once a place where Rommel had thrived, now became a cruel and barren trap, with the British closing in from all sides. By November 2nd, Rommel realized that the battle was lost. His forces had been driven from El Alamein, and the British were now well on their way to securing the strategic advantage in North Africa. Rommel, ever the pragmatist, made the difficult decision to order a full retreat, knowing that any attempt to hold his ground would result in further unnecessary losses. The withdrawal marked the end of the Axis's push in North Africa, as the British Eighth Army, having broken through at El Alamein, was now poised to continue their advance into Tunisia. For Rommel, the retreat from El Alamein represented not just a tactical defeat, but the collapse of his once promising campaign in North Africa. His forces, exhausted and demoralized, were no longer capable of mounting a successful defense, and the overwhelming superiority of the British made it impossible for the Axis to hold on to any further territory. Rommel, despite his brilliance as a commander, had been unable to overcome the logistical, strategic, and numerical advantages of the British. The war in North Africa, which had begun with the promise of a swift and decisive victory for the Axis, now seemed lost. Rommel's retreat was a bitter acknowledgement of the failure of his campaign, marking the beginning of the end of the Axis's presence in North Africa. The Battle of El Alamein would go down in history as a turning point in the Second World War. For the British, it was the beginning of a long-awaited victory. For Rommel and the Axis forces, it marked the beginning of a humiliating retreat that would culminate in the eventual surrender of the Axis forces in North Africa in May 1943. Rommel, the Desert Fox, had been outmaneuvered in the very desert where he had once triumphed. Erwin Rommel was, without question, one of the most brilliant tacticians of World War II. His ability to read the battlefield, adapt to shifting circumstances, and execute swift, aggressive maneuvers earned him a reputation as the Desert Fox and a place in the annals of military history. Rommel's success in the North African campaign, particularly in the early stages, was a testament to his ingenuity and the application of his core principles of mobile warfare, surprise, and flexibility. However, as the Second Battle of El Alamein demonstrated, even the most skilled commanders are not immune to the pressures of war, and Rommel's tactical brilliance was not always enough to overcome the strategic and logistical challenges that ultimately led to his defeat. Rommel's genius lay in his ability to outthink and outmaneuver his opponents. His understanding of modern warfare, especially in the desert, where traditional battle lines were hard to maintain and mobility was paramount, set him apart from many of his contemporaries. Rommel was a master of deception, often feinting attacks to mislead his enemies and then striking decisively at the weakest point in their lines. His aggressive use of armored units and motorized infantry allowed him to quickly exploit gaps in the enemy's defenses and create confusion behind their lines. This was evident in his early victories in North Africa, such as his stunning success at Agadabiya in 1941, where he outflanked and overwhelmed the British Eighth Army, forcing them to retreat. Rommel's approach was often characterized by his willingness to take risks. He was not afraid to gamble on bold moves, trusting in his instincts and the speed of his forces to turn the tide in his favor. This aggressive style of warfare, while successful in many instances, also created vulnerabilities. Rommel's forces, particularly his tank units, were often spread thin, and his reliance on fast-moving strikes meant that his forces could be caught off guard if the enemy anticipated his next move. His success depended not just on his tactical brilliance, but also on his ability to maintain the initiative, keeping his opponents on the back foot. This worked well when he had the resources and freedom to maneuver, but as the war dragged on and the Axis supply lines became more strained, Rommel's ability to execute his strategies began to falter. One of the key limitations of Rommel's tactics, particularly in the context of the Second Battle of El Alamein, was his inability to adapt quickly to changing conditions. Rommel was a commander who thrived when the battlefield was fluid and when he could make rapid decisions based on limited information. However, the battle at El Alamein was not fought on the open, shifting terrain that had once favored Rommel's tactics. Instead, the British offensive, with its overwhelming firepower, precise intelligence, and logistical superiority, forced Rommel into a defensive position where his usual methods could not be applied effectively. The British were able to counter Rommel's moves and exploit his weaknesses, particularly his lack of reserves and the vulnerability of his stretched supply lines. Rommel's ability to anticipate enemy movements was one of his most prized qualities, but at El Alamein, his intuition was not enough to overcome the sheer scale of the British offensive. Montgomery, who had spent months preparing for this moment, was able to anticipate Rommel's tactics and outmaneuver him at every turn. The British had learned from their previous mistakes and were able to exploit the very weaknesses that Rommel had once used to his advantage. Their overwhelming numbers, combined with superior logistical support and air superiority, left Rommel with little room to maneuver. Rommel's usual approach of quick, decisive strikes was neutralized by the British ability to control the tempo of the battle, forcing him into a defensive posture where he could no longer dictate the terms of engagement. Another significant limitation for Rommel was his reliance on his Italian allies. Throughout the North African campaign, Rommel had been forced to coordinate his actions with Italian forces, many of whom were less equipped, less trained, and less capable than their German counterparts. At El Alamein, the Italian units were unable to hold key positions or respond quickly enough to Rommel's orders. This lack of coordination between the German and Italian forces created a gap in Rommel's defenses that the British were able to exploit. Rommel's inability to rely on his allies during critical moments of the battle severely hindered his ability to mount a successful defense and execute his planned counterattacks. Perhaps one of the most significant limitations of Rommel's tactical genius was the issue of logistics. Throughout the North African campaign, Rommel's forces had been plagued by supply shortages, particularly in fuel and ammunition. As the British offensive at El Alamein gained momentum, Rommel's ability to respond to the rapidly changing situation was further hampered by these logistical difficulties. The desert terrain, which had once worked in his favor, now became an obstacle as Rommel's supply lines were stretched thin and reinforcements were delayed or cut off. Rommel's reliance on fast-moving, highly mobile units required a constant flow of supplies, and as that flow slowed, his ability to execute his tactics effectively diminished. Ultimately, Rommel's tactical brilliance could not overcome the overwhelming challenges he faced at El Alamein. His strategic position had been compromised by the British, and his forces were stretched too thin to mount a successful defense. The failure at El Alamein was not a result of a single mistake or miscalculation, but rather a culmination of factors: logistical shortcomings, the failure of Italian allies, and the overwhelming strength of the British forces. Rommel's genius, while undeniable, was not infallible, and the battle marked the limits of his abilities in the face of a well-coordinated, well-prepared enemy. Despite his defeat at El Alamein, Rommel's legacy as one of the greatest tacticians of World War II endures. His ability to think outside the box, to make bold decisions under pressure, and to inspire his troops made him a figure admired by both his allies and enemies. However, the limitations of his tactics, particularly in the face of overwhelming opposition and resource constraints, served as a stark reminder that even the greatest commanders are vulnerable when their strategic options are exhausted. The Battle of El Alamein was a turning point in the North African campaign, and for General Erwin Rommel, it marked the end of an era. The Desert Fox, known for his swift and cunning tactics, had been outmaneuvered by the overwhelming force and preparation of the British Eighth Army. For the British, the victory at El Alamein represented the beginning of the end of Axis power in North Africa, while for Rommel, it was the painful acknowledgement that his forces, stretched thin and hampered by logistical issues, were no longer capable of achieving victory in the desert. Rommel's defeat at El Alamein was not the result of a single tactical error or a breakdown in leadership. Instead, it was the culmination of a series of challenges, many beyond his control, that left his forces vulnerable to the British onslaught. The logistical difficulties, the failure of Italian allies, and the overwhelming superiority of the British forces in terms of numbers, supplies, and preparation all played crucial roles in the battle's outcome. Rommel, a commander known for his ability to anticipate enemy movements and strike with precision, found himself facing an enemy that was well prepared, disciplined, and capable of adapting to every move he made. Yet despite this defeat, Rommel's legacy remains one of complexity. He was not only a tactician of extraordinary ability, but also a leader who inspired fierce loyalty among his men. His successes in North Africa, particularly in the early stages of the campaign, demonstrated his genius in mobile warfare, his ability to make rapid, effective decisions, and his exceptional understanding of the desert terrain. Rommel's innovative use of armored units and motorized infantry, his ability to turn seemingly impossible situations into opportunities, and his unorthodox approach to warfare earned him respect and admiration across the world. However, as El Alamein showed, no amount of tactical brilliance can overcome the weight of strategic limitations. Rommel's penchant for aggressive, high-risk maneuvers worked in many battles, but in this particular engagement, the British had learned from their past mistakes and were able to neutralize his strengths. His reliance on speed and maneuver was offset by the British's logistical advantage, their superior air power, and their ability to execute a methodical, well-coordinated assault. Rommel's forces, already exhausted from months of constant fighting, were simply too stretched to keep up with the pace of the battle. The tactical genius that had once made him a terror to the British now appeared to be insufficient in the face of a more capable, better prepared adversary. Rommel's defeat at El Alamein marked the beginning of the end of the Axis presence in North Africa, and it would ultimately lead to the full retreat of the Axis forces from the continent by May 1943. Yet, even in retreat, Rommel's reputation as a brilliant tactician remained intact. His ability to recognize when a situation was hopeless and make the difficult decision to withdraw rather than sacrifice his forces unnecessarily was a hallmark of his leadership. Though El Alamein was a defeat, it was not the end of his career. Rommel would go on to command German forces in Europe, and his tactical brilliance would continue to shape his legacy. In the final analysis, Rommel's legacy is one of both admiration and caution. His ability to lead, to inspire, and to adapt in the face of adversity made him one of the most respected military leaders of World War II. However, El Alamein proved that even the greatest of commanders are vulnerable when faced with the right combination of resources, preparation, and strategic execution. Rommel's defeat was not a failure of leadership, but a consequence of overwhelming opposition, a reminder that, in war, even the best laid plans can be undone by factors outside one's control. The complexity of Rommel's legacy lies not in his victories or his defeats, but in the unique challenges of the Desert War, where speed, surprise, and agility were often the difference between success and failure. While he was ultimately outflanked at El Alamein, his ability to adapt, his understanding of the terrain, and his leadership on the battlefield remain central to the story of the North African campaign. Rommel's brilliance and his eventual defeat highlights the brutal realities of war, where even the most brilliant tactics can be eclipsed by superior preparation, resources, and strategic execution. His story is one of extraordinary ability, tempered by the inevitable limitations of war.